This particular session is a welcome and introduction about why ethics matter in scholarly publishing. Next slide, please. Just to introduce myself, I'm Nancy Cheshire. I am the COPE Council and Trustee Board Chair. I have an editorial background, having been the editor-in-chief of two different journals. My work prior to that was that I practiced perinatology or high-risk obstetrics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So, getting to this particular session, Why Ethics Matters in Scholarly Publishing is the title of the week. Just to kind of set the stage for this, ethical principles guide and support researchers, editors, reviewers, authors, and others involved in publication ethics to do their work responsibly and transparently. These principles are important to help make sure research is accountable, to prevent misconduct, to help others repeat the research, as we know science is based on reproducibility in part. We want to protect people from publications that lack integrity for one reason or the other. We want to help guide decision-making when complex issues come up, and they seem to be ever increasingly complex. And we also want to provide best practice guidelines for ethical journal publishing. One of the things that I've come to realize is that while much of the work we produce has to do with how to deal with things when the process goes badly for one reason or the other, I think it's really important that a lot of our work, if you really look across the expanse of our guidelines, is really how to run a good journal or a publishing house, or how to work with people who are different kind of stakeholders. So we kind of span the horizon of publication ethics in that way. One of the conversations that comes up a lot is, where does research ethics and publication ethics start and end? Clearly, they overlap. Research ethics is making sure research is conducted honestly, accurately, safely, and without making up or altering data or images, so-called fabrication and falsification. Plagiarism is the other part of what at least the US NIH labels as misconduct. This is following rules about what counts as copying, including copying your own work. It gives proper credit when using others' ideas. Different terms that get thrown around here include self-plagiarism and text recycling, which is a somewhat preferred word. We are going to be touching on peer review to make sure that the review process is fair, unbiased, and timely. Other issues that will come up during the week in different sessions are authorship and contributorship, allegations of misconduct and how to deal with those, how to handle data, how to make sure as a researcher and as an editor or journal publisher and an institution, how data is handled responsibly, including how it's used, stored, registered, and shared. In this era of open science, which is rapidly changing and will continue to change scholarly publishing, the issue of shared data and registering it becomes incredibly important. Post-publication review, allowing for robust conversations about published articles in a variety of different formats and places, are ways that research can continue to be and actually improve in strength about our self-correction. And talking about conflicts of interest, making sure that everybody's potential sources of bias, implicit or otherwise, are known, so that people who are looking at the literature and reading it can try to put it in potential context. So this graphic tries to give a little context to the sort of scope of things that we will be discussing, and which all of you who are interested in this topic are dealing with at some level or another in your work. So who is the ecosystem of scholarly publishing? This involves different platforms, changing technology, and I know we're going to hear a bit about that in our first panel discussion. Where does AI fit in? Preprints, different kinds of repositories. What kind of publishing is micro-publishing, and does that have the same requirements for ethical behavior as the large format journal articles that are things that we all know about? And how do we go about detecting integrity problems? There are a lot of different stakeholders in scholarly publishing. These include funders, universities, and research institutes. I would also offer that they also include private industry that funds and does a lot of their own research, authors, publishers, peer reviewers, the public organizations, and people focused on preventing, identifying, correcting unreliable research publication, and the people who actually read and use the work that all are publishing. There is a rapid increase in the numbers of journals, publishers, articles being published, and scholars who are publishing this work. And so as we think about things now, we have to think about it at scale. And again, that's going to be part of the conversation, I'm sure, in the next session. There are threats to publication integrity. There's increasingly complex and evolving schemes to subvert the reliability of the work we publish. This includes paper mills, fabrication, falsification, AI, and we know there's something next. We just need to be alert to it and be ready to respond when it happens. There are clearly perverse incentives to publish in academia, and there's a lot of work being done on trying to understand how that ship could be shifted, perhaps to take the enormous pressures off of just publish anything that many of our academics face. And of course, money. Money is a threat to publication integrity. There's a lot of money to be made in publishing, whether you're a legitimate publisher or journal or other stakeholder or an illegitimate one. And then, of course, there's rising public skepticism. This is a driver for us to be sure that we are making every effort we can to make sure that what is published goes through the peer review system, if that's the system that's being used, that it has high integrity and is reliable. And then when that does go awry, that there's a need to correct that literature as thoroughly and as quickly as possible. The public is aware that problems with publication ethics may affect funding decisions for granting agencies and also for different universities and research institutes. And there's current and future societal growth and change, and they should be able to have reliable information to use in their decision making. So I hope with that background, we've set the stage for this first session. Um, and I'm very pleased to be moderating this session. It's entitled Why Ethics Matter in Scholarly Communications, a conversation with the early leaders of the Committee on Publication Ethics. In alphabetical order, we're joined today by Professor Ginny Barbour, who is the editor-in-chief of the Medical Journal of Australia. She's an adjunct professor at Queensland University of Technology, and she trained in clinical and academic hematology. She was one of the founding editors of PLOS Medicine. She's co-chair of DORA and was previously chair of COPE. And we were remembering just before this that she was the past chair the first year I was on the COPE Council. So we did overlap then, and it was just a pleasure and an inspiration to do so. We're also joined today by three other early COPE members. Professor Michael Farthing was one of the founding chairs of COPE. He was the editor of Gut, and he had practiced, and perhaps still does, as a specialist GI, which was a specialist GI and liver journal at that time in the early 1990s. He became interested in research misconduct and publication ethics through direct experience. At the time, he was a clinical academic at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, and most editors at that time would just reject a dodgy paper. So with that as the norm, Michael helped kick off a process to change that. Dr. Charlotte Hogg is the executive editor of, it may be Haug, I'm sorry, Charlotte, if I mispronounced that, executive editor of the New England Journal of Medicine AI Journal. She is from 2002 to 2015. She was the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Norwegian Medical Association and a member of the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, known as ICMJE, also known as the Vancouver Group. She was a COPE Council member from 2005 to 2015 and served as vice chair of COPE from 2012 to 2015. And lastly, for our panels today is Richard Smith, who is also a founding chair of COPE. He is the chair of the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change and a co-chair of the Lancet Commission on the Value of Death. He was once the editor of the BMJ and chief executive of the BMJ Publishing Group. And as I said, he was one of the founders of COPE. So I hope these introductions, although not doing their work justice, gives you an idea of the type of experiences we're going to be hearing from today. And so we will now just open it up to the panel. The way we're going to do this, I've got some questions that I'm going to ask the panelists. We'll just go from there. If you all want to do any self-introductions, you're welcome to do that. Anybody on our panel want to say anything more? Nope. Okay. So my first question is for Michael and Richard. The work you two together to anonymously discuss difficult cases you were dealing with at GUT and at the BMJ spawned the creation of COPE. Can you tell us the origin story? How did this all actually get going? And what, if you can remember, was the original set of issues that you all discussed together?
Well, I'd just taken over as editor of GUT, and I have to say, within a few weeks, it was just a very few weeks, I was suddenly completely overwhelmed by the sort of dodgy material, as I saw it was at that time, coming through across my desk. I mean, it was extraordinary. These were people I knew. These were people in the business, in the specialty that I knew. And to be honest, I really didn't know what to do. And Richard will probably remember one or two early conversations that we had. And he was my boss at the time because he was running the whole group. And I was just a small part of that group. I said, Richard, what the hell can we do? And what did you say, Richard?
Well, I said, this is all very difficult, Mike. But thank you for spotting all of this. So I suppose just to put a bit of background, I mean, I can't remember exactly when it started, but sometime in the 90s. I mean, I'd been the editor of the BMJ since 1991, but I'd been with the BMJ since 1979. And my predecessor, Stephen Locke, was, people thought, obsessed with research misconduct. He saw it everywhere at a time when lots of other people thought this is a non-issue. This doesn't happen. Scientists are utterly reliable. It's a lot of nonsense. It happens every so often because somebody goes crazy, but that doesn't really matter because science is self-correcting and the whole thing is sorted out. And a lot of people thought that Stephen was very over the top with his anxieties, but he'd got me to write about episodes of misconduct. And actually, my experience was a bit like Mike's, that when I became the editor, I suddenly saw all sorts of things that began to bother me a lot. And I got very involved with a case that involved Norway early on and taught me a lot about how to mishandle accusations of research misconduct. So when Mike came to me. We talked about the particular case, which I can't clearly remember, Mike. Perhaps you can. But we also talked about, I think it was you, Mike, that said, well, here you and I are talking about this. Why don't we share this learning with others? And why don't we, involve others in these conversations? And you suggested that we include Richard Horton, had become the editor of The Lancet at the time. So we invited Richard and we invited a few others. I remember actually Charlotte, one of your predecessors, Magna, came to one of the early meetings, and we would sit round the table in BMA House and discuss kind of cases that we had seen. It was a sort of self-help group for editors, really. And we realized kind of early on that this was a bit risky sitting around talking about other people's wickedness. So we invited Ian Kennedy, who a professor of law, to come and join us and help us to avoid going off the rails. And I mean, it was enjoyable. And then we began to think, well, we need to kind of organize this a bit more. And that's when we began to think about, people would pay something to belong. And I must say, I find it remarkable how Cope has grown since. It's hugely impressive. If I think back on most of the things I've been involved in, they've all flopped and fizzled out. But here's one that's gone somewhere. So congratulations to you.
Anything you wanted to add to that, Mike?
Well, no, I think Richard encapsulates that very early bit of process, which I think we all recognised. Ian Kennedy was a dear friend of ours, and is still around, still alive. And he absolutely got it. I mean, he is a lawyer. He's an academic lawyer, but and he thinks and sees very clearly. And he's done some very big reviews for the British government over the years. Very, very important reviews of clinical practice. But at the same time, he's a balanced human being. He recognizes that he's dealing with humanity and people who are imperfect. And he was a great colleague. And in fact, when we went on and took the next step, which was to create the UK Research Integrity Office, and get a grant to do that from the Funding Council, he was very much part of that and became its first chair.
Huh. So that was what you did after Richard. You commented that you decided you would start raising, having membership dues. You actually went and formally got a grant to do this work. Is that right?
That was phase two. That was because I think the thing that concerned us, we were really only dealing with publication and publication ethics. And the only people that had shown really much interest in what we were doing or what we were proposing or what we had proposed was publishers.
Okay.
And we were very keen to broaden that horizon to include researchers, individual researchers who would come, and also research organizations, so institutes of research, universities. That's going quite well too.
Yeah, it is. It is going well. Do either of you remember kind of what some of the themes were of the original articles that were, or processes that you were facing with that were problematic? I think it would be fun to kind of see where you were, and as we go along with this conversation, what kind of the things are that are coming up now.
I tell you, I have a memory. I mean, probably many of the people listening to this will know the name of Peter Wilmshurst, a cardiologist with a very highly developed sense of right and wrong. And he had made many accusations about misconduct in research in all sorts of ways, producing fraudulent data, not declaring conflicts of interest, saying you were an author when you'd had nothing to do with it. And he used to send these accusations to the BMJ and to the Lancet and to other journals. I know he sent them to the New England Journal. And people began to think he's a bit of a nutcase. He sort of seems rather obsessed with this. And Stephen, my predecessor, got very fed up with him and said, I don't want to hear any more from Peter. Anyway, when I became the editor, I thought we ought to take him seriously. And so we had a meeting where we had people come along. I don't know if you were there, Mike. I think you might have been. Richard Horton was there. People from the Lancet came. We closed the doors and said, you can say anything you want to say here. This is a safe space. And he began to list case after case of misconduct, many of them involving, as Mike was saying, very prominent people in British and American medicine. And he had great eye for detail, and you could have heard a pin drop as he spoke. And I sat there sort of chairing the meeting thinking, oh my goodness, what's going to happen when he stops? Are people going to jump up and say, how dare you say that about this famous professor or whatever? But in fact, the reaction was the opposite. People stood up and said, well, I did know about that, but I never did anything about it. And actually, he was kind of supported and he was kind of brought back into the fold. And he used to come to these early meetings of COPE. So he was not an editor, but he was very important in the development of COPE. And I think we saw all the things you kind of listed, lots of arguments about authorship, people failing to declare conflicts of interest. I mean, complete fraud in cases. I mean, for me, it sort of culminated in a way in spending a day and a half in the High Court in Toronto around the case of misconduct, which was a very extraordinary experience, which I can tell people about if they want to hear, but I think that's enough from me for now.
Okay, let's switch gears here and now go to Ginny and Charlotte. When did you become active in this group, and how was it to join an organization kind of as it was expanding?
I can start. I joined in 2002. I became the editor-in-chief of the Norwegian Medical Journal. At Magne, as Richard just said, my predecessor, he encouraged me to go and started going to COPE right away. And at that time, there were 4 meetings a year. My first meeting, it was very, very British. Everything was British. There was one other person, Andre from Belgium. And I remember, Mike, I don't think you remember, but I remember you calling us our Europeans. And this was before Brexit. So, so it was very much, for me as a new editor in a small country where we didn't have many other, if any, others to discuss problems with. This was it was a very good experience, even if I felt very un-British. But it was this feeling of we are sort of a club, and we are talking about, we are helping each other, and we're not making judgments. But of course, it was very BMJ in the beginning, even if Lancet was there. My first meeting was in your office, Richard. I still remember you wearing a pink shirt, and it sort of impressed me. And we were not sitting on the floor around this desk, but it almost felt like it. And later, so we moved to a meeting room. Mike took over as sort of formal chair, and then a few years later, we made the drastic move out of the BMJ buildings across the Havikstock Square. So we went like 10 minutes, and then we were sort of independent of BMJ. But I think, what was very, very important, we met in person. I came from Norway for those meetings. They lasted for 2 hours. It was sort of tea time or something in in London, but it was extremely useful. So I had my own first serious misconduct case in 2005, and then at that time I had been listening listening and listening to and discussing how to handle these cases. And just heard about some prominent cases in the UK. In Norway, we have this situation that we're so few people that if there is a misconduct case, it sort of involves everybody you know. So, and this was a serious plagiarism case involving all, the whole best people in that specialty in Norway. And I got, if I hadn't been trained to how to think about it, how to proceed, not to accuse, how to ask, how not to ask, all those things, I brought it to COPE. Even if it was Norwegian, I was just showing what they had plagiarized, and it helped me through that case. I still remember the first comment I got when I presented the case in COPE was, "What is your relationship to your employer, the Norwegian Medical Association?" Because these cases, if you handle them wrong, uh, the people you're accusing or they are so strong they can have you fired.
Interesting. Ginny?
Yes. So, greetings from Australia. So I first got involved with COPE when I was a sort of baby editor at the Lancet, which was sort of back in before 2003. I sort of knew about what was happening, but I wasn't really involved in any kind of massive way. I sort of stepped into it, particularly when I started at PLOS Medicine, because I could begin to see there that we were going to need to take it seriously. We're a new journal. We were sort of facing kind of challenges that I think we hadn't really seen at other journals. And so I got onto the council. I became secretary, and then I was chair from 2012 to 2017. And I think that the time that I was really involved was when I think COPE really began to expand enormously. It began to get a huge amount of credibility in the kind of the publishing and also the academic system more generally. We went from, at the time when I was chair in particular, we went from a few hundred journals up to kind of several thousand. That was because a couple of big publishers signed up. And it gained a level of credibility and an expectation of what we would do that was kind of interesting, because all of a sudden we were seen as the solution to all the problems that Richard and Mike had kindly found for us, and what were we going to do about it? And I particularly remember that when the process of when we were at PLOS, we started with a biology journal, then a medical journal, and I was the one that said that we had to pay attention to this because in medical publishing the issues affected patients, so that was why we had to be really careful about what we published. And there was definitely a sense that it wasn't an issue for non-medical journals. And I can remember that when PLOS One opened its doors, I think literally the first or the second paper in the door was something so horrific that we kind of realized that finally there was an understanding that this was an issue across all of publishing, and we had to take it extremely seriously. And that was the point at which I think that COPE really sort of took off in a way that it became an important thing across all of publishing. I would say that for me, the other thing that happened when I was there was that we expanded into different time zones. So that wasn't obviously just with me moving abroad, but the fact that we wouldn't just have a few Europeans like Charlotte. We had people from everywhere, and I think that again there was this sense of a community that was a proper global community, and this is something that we truly had to handle in a consistent way. That was the moment when we started to do meetings online, and I agree with Charlotte. I really love the in-person meetings. I think they gave us a sense of community and sort of also a sense of a safe space within a confined room that when you're online is much harder to replicate, but at the same time it can be much more inclusive. There were lots of other things that happened at that time, but I'll stop there for now.
So a question for the four of you. Up until your discovery at PLOS that it was not a medical journal that was being affected, this was all biomedical or probably all medical. When did you see, and this is for anybody, the need to expand into other STM topics. I don't know that they were called STM in the early 2000s, but other STM topics. And now it involves any kind of scholarly publishing, any domain, arts, humanities, social sciences, law, etc. When did you see that divergence or increased inclusivity of domain happen, and how did it happen? Do you recall?
I can start. I think, it happened as Ginny was explaining. We were getting more visibility, and I would like at this point to mention something that was extremely important for the expansion of COPE, and that was Liz Wager and her flow chart, because she created. We started. We were getting many more requests or people trying to have things solved than we could manage in these meetings. And we also saw that we started to see that there were many questions coming over again and over again. That was a really sort of introductory publication ethics. And she was first a council member and then after chair, and the flow charts that she made, and you still have them, was extremely important for us to be able to expand, because otherwise we couldn't scale. We couldn't discuss everything from sort of scratch. And when we were starting to sort of expand and show that, that there were ways to deal with these things in a systematic way, then we got all these questions. So I think, and then the publishers, I think, also started being very interested in not being involved with, journals or research that was not good. And we had, an enormous expansion at this time of journals. Because of what happened on the internet. So I think it came, we had a big discussion whether publishers should at all be allowed to join COPE. That was for a couple of years we had that discussion, because it was the safe space for editors, and publishers were actually not necessarily on the editor's side. So that, even if we're all sort of in it together, they have different interests. So I think, it came with the expansion of COPE, and then all of a sudden, people had questions, and we could see that they came from all different areas. Some of them are similar, some are more particular for medicine. I think we also could see that why medicine, we very early, it was clear we had a lot of conflicts of interest, lots of money in the research. And then we had other types of research where this became important, climate research, for example. So sometimes I envied the editors in like pure math journals or something like that, because it was just math. It was not money.
One thing I might just add to that is that I think that another thing that was incredibly important was this series of cases that we had been collected from the very beginning, and they're just the fantastic support for that, I think, which was the rigorous documentation of the cases, the documentation of the discussions. And there were many people who did this. Linda Goff was one of the people who kind of chased. If you ever submitted a case to COPE, you would know that Linda would be after you if you hadn't followed up. And it was incredibly important, because again, as Charlotte said, we couldn't discuss every paper, everything that came to us, but we had this enormous resource that we could point people back to. And one of the things that I was really struck by was that it was the same issues coming up across the time and space and specialty. So the mathematicians, maybe not authorship, but they would certainly have issues to do with influence on their research. You'd find that somebody from countries that you didn't really think were thinking necessarily hard about publication ethics would be facing challenges that we also had. So it was a real I think, as I said, it built a community globally that and because it was backed by fantastic documentation and resources, it sort of was able to expand fairly painlessly, actually, in some ways.
Huh. Any other comments?
I
So,
must add that I think because it started with medical journals, and I mean, a lot of the peer review congress was around medical journals, there was a sense at one time that all these terrible things only happen in medical journals. You know, they don't happen anywhere else. I can remember those times, but slowly but surely, everybody realized that, you know, wherever there are human beings, there's going to be fraud and misconduct.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Charlotte, you mentioned that people were coming to COPE to solve their problems. Did you mean in a regulatory way? Because this is still a tension that comes up for us all the time, is this sense that even though we state very clearly that we are not regulatory and that we are primarily an educational organization, there is still a common belief that COPE should be able to regulate these sorts of things. Was that early on an issue for COPE, and how did that all get managed? And did we evolve from being non-regulatory or regulatory to non-regulatory? So kind of, could you all talk about that whole
I think
aspect?
Richard has a hand up. You can start, Richard, and then I'll follow up.
Yes, I mean, when we began, we were simply advising each other, and it was then for each editor to go and do what he or she thought was the right thing to do. But one of the big debates we had right from the beginning is, well, we're quite, you know, heavy on authors, we're quite heavy on reviewers, we're heavy on owners, but what about editors? And it always felt to me that COPE could only be taken seriously if it paid attention to wicked editors. At the time, there had been various examples published. I mean, if you look back historically, you can see lots of terrible misbehavior from editors. And that was something that we found quite awkward. And I've still continued to come across cases. People don't really know where to go and what to do about misbehaving editors. I mean, it gets tied up with the whole issue of editorial freedom. And I think that was something we found difficult, and I don't think we'd solved the problem by the time I drifted away from COPE. And I don't really know how it's gone since, but it does seem to me that for COPE to be taken seriously, it has to be able to do something about misbehaving editors.
So you go ahead, Charlotte.
No, so I think, as Richard said, it was absolutely necessary to sort of look at ourselves as editors. And so that was sort of when the best practice for editors and stuff like that was developed. And we encouraged people, again, I think Liz Wager was very influential in being systematic in this way, sort of to audit ourselves, our own journals, for example. And then we realized that we issued guidance for editors, what to do and what not to do. You mentioned a couple of things in your introduction, Nancy, like supplementary material or additions or things like that. But coming back to the question of regulatory versus advice, I mean, we try to say that we were in sort of the advice business and trying to move things and trying to not of course, being international and global, it meant impossible to be a regulatory body, but giving advice, but giving people sort of tools to do things without being fired or being get into a very difficult situation. And I think that was the strength, and I think it still is the strength that you're saying that we're giving our best advice what you do in this situation, instead of trying to be sort of prescribe exactly how things should be. And I think that came also from the fact that we saw the expansion of different journals, different subjects, different countries with very different publication traditions. So when we got into, South America, China, where journals are usually owned by are often owned by the universities or the government. That is a different thing from, we have been very worried about the big commercial publishers, and then we could see that there are many different ways of doing it, but still, what we all had in common was to protect the sort of the scientific literature, and that was what it came down to.
Yeah, and certainly since then, there's also different publishing models, not just who the owner is, but you look at preprints, for instance, if you want to consider those publications, and many people do. There's no peer review there. There's certainly other big publishers really have very different models. So having to expand the tent to include all of these different things, I still feel is a tension for COPE, and it certainly must have been throughout the life of the organization. We do have a related question, and I think we could spend a long time on it, but just any advice from you all about what a baby editor who's just stepping into this role, what kind of training do you recommend that they consider so that they're prepared? I mean, Mike, you said, "Oh my God, I had no idea this was going to be happening." What do you wish you had known, and how would that have helped you?
I mean, Nancy, the best training that Richard and I got was to join COPE and to form COPE. That was the melting pot. That's where everything came out, and we could discuss it safely behind what we thought were closed walls. Now, I suspect, well, with Zoom, with this sort of ability to communicate across the world, across the world's time zones, that gives us a lot more freedom than if you've all got to huddle together in one room. And so those days are gone. So I would strongly encourage people to join as individuals or through their journal, to come to meetings, to listen to the discussion, and think hard about it, because there are only a limited number of really serious issues that need to be dealt with, and I mean, I'd be interested to hear what Richard has got to say about that. But I personally felt that I learned most by attending the meetings, having open, free-floating discussion, and also to realize that there were some bad guys in the room, i.e., that is the editors. And we couldn't just reject or neglect the fact that people amongst our own cohort were actually misbehaving. Is that unfair, Richard?
No. I mean, I think we always found it difficult to know how to deal with colleagues who were misbehaving. And when it comes back to the question of COPE being a regulatory body, clearly it can't be. But of course, it can potentially, I suppose, expel editors from being members of COPE if they have misbehaved. Not that that's the most terrible thing that can happen to you. But on the question of training, I mean, I was very conscious when I became the editor of the BMJ. I mean, I'd grown up through the editorial department in the BMJ, and clearly an apprenticeship in a way is the best way to train, because you encounter all of these different things. But when it became my responsibility to appoint editors to our specialist journals like Gut, I was very aware that you might be someone with very limited editorial experience. You'd peer reviewed, you'd sat on an editorial board, but you hadn't really lived and breathed editing. And then suddenly you were the editor of a cardiology journal. I mean, you wouldn't contemplate doing it the other way around, that you'd take an editor and say, right, now you're a cardiologist. I mean, they clearly need to be training. And so we did develop at the BMJ a training course for our editors. It lasted a couple of days, and we outsourced it to someone called Tim Albert, who was very good at training. And Richard Horton and I used to go along and speak at these meetings, but eventually expelled both of us because he couldn't control Richard. And so he said, I just can't carry on with this. So he did it himself. But I think I think it's I see it because so in Britain with the BMJ and the Lancet, there's been a tradition that the editor has come up through the ranks. So they're not, we're not distinguished academics or whatever, which is much more the model with the American journals. And I think there's a real tension there because I think the whole thing, not just dealing with misconduct and publication ethics, the whole enterprise has become much more complex over the years. It's not just a matter of sifting through a pile of scientific papers and deciding which you're going to publish. So I think increasingly there does need to be some kind of training, which is best done as an apprenticeship rather than you're just appointed one day as an editor and then given half a day's training or something. I mean, the majority of editors have no training whatsoever. They just start in. I mean, it's a sort of amateur business in many ways, and yet it's an increasingly complex world.
Yeah, and that gets even more complicated when there's a guest editor for a paper that, or for a journal that may have zero experience even as a board member, for instance. That's something
I
we're
have,
certainly seeing. Charlotte, yeah.
yeah, I have one small request for cope in the middle of all of this. So I was, so I'm now executive editor of a new journal published by the New England Journal of Medicine Group. We started taking submissions in 2023. When I joined, there were 3 other people. None of them had any editorial experience. They were super in their field, just as Richard said. And I was the one trying to sort of give little classes in publication ethics, and the problems when they felt that I was extremely, making things complicated when it should be easy. And I reached out to COPE, but I understand why, and maybe I was, they're making the rule, but you have to be a member of COPE to get access to the online learning, e-learning, and I wish there was like at least something that was free, because even if it's much better, as Richard said, to be sort of learning on the job, it's nice, to get exposure to some of the questions that you never would think about if you're just a really good doctor or specialist, all the issues, so that at least maybe there's a red flag, you understand, oh, maybe this was what they were talking about, maybe we should discuss this. And so, because I think learning some basics is very important, and it's very different from being head of cardiology at some hospital.
Right. And that's the way I rose up. I mean, it's interesting, Richard, that you commented about the tension between the US and European traditions. I was a practicing OBGYN, got on the editorial board, became the editor. And so, like you said, I really didn't know that much about a lot of these issues when I took over. Ginny, any thoughts from you?
Oh, look, I think one of the things that, that I was just reflecting on, the discussion around dealing with, editors who don't behave themselves. I think there's one specific part of editors not behaving themselves right now, which possibly plays into into the whole ecosystem. So, one of the things that I became more and more convinced about was that, we were the, canaries in the coal mine at the end of the process. The problem was not with the journals that were publishing things. The problem with research misconduct started right back in the institutions, started right back in the culture of the lab or the research group or whatever. That's where the real issues were. We were just picking things up. Now, of course, there are journals that don't do the right thing, but largely speaking, many of the issues, the research misconduct, they're not caused by the journals. They're caused by, whichever institution you're in. But what we're seeing right now, of course, is that there are increasing problems that are being identified by, not just by editors, they're being identified by, people who are commenting on, PubPeer and on sort of other related initiatives. And then they're coming to journals and asking them to take action for papers that they've published. And what I hear time and time again, and I'm actually at a meeting right now in Sydney on research integrity, is most of the time editors do not take action, even if misconduct is clearly demonstrated to them. And time again, I hear this as a real failing of the editorial process. And cope indeed comes up. You know, why are journals not responding to my emails? Why are they not dealing with it? So I think we've almost moved on to a sort of a secondary problem. Are those editors, you know, not taking action because they're busy or because they don't understand the importance? But some of it is certainly the case that they are not professional editors, and they may just not have the time to do it or realize it's important. So I think one of the things that COPE has to do right now is to really, you know, kind of make sure it is absolutely embedded in the whole ecosystem, so that what we do right at the end of the process, you know, is part of the whole solution to addressing research misconduct more generally, and, you know, taking action as a sort of community.
Yeah, I think the new revised research, rejection, retraction guidelines and the new EOC guidelines, in part, will strengthen the hand of interested editors to be able to take necessary action. There has been a lot of confusion, I think, about, you know, do you have to wait for the institution to do their investigation? And I think we've tried hard to clarify some of those areas of confusion, hopefully to strengthen the hand. But it's a hard job. I mean, 80% of what you're doing probably is trying to get papers peer reviewed and published. And then these things come up, and all of a sudden they're sucking a lot of resources away. I did want to go back and clarify one thing. Alyssa has commented and has put in the webinar chat that the Introduction to Publication Ethics e-learning module is free to anybody.
Good.
And the link is in the chat for those who are interested in looking at that. So that is available. And there are a few other questions here regarding this sort of training, and something I think Ginny, you and Charlotte have both commented, actually all of you have commented on, is this sense that if you as an editor or a publisher focus on these things, others in the organization kind of feel like you're wasting their time and such, and how to sort of really inculcate the need for practicing our craft at a high level based on these foundational issues. And I think that's culturally just really hard to do. But what kind of solution do you see as far as trying to make this happen, Richard?
I mean, I think one of the big changes that happened in the early days of COPE was and Mike referred to this, we began to think we cannot just ignore these things. When we see something that we find very disturbing, even though we haven't published the paper, we can't just turn away from it and say, well, that's nothing to do with us, and just reject the paper, which I think had been a lot of the custom until we started COPE. But certainly we then felt at the BMJ, at that time we'd get about 5,000 studies a year. We'd publish a few hundred, but we were rejecting the vast majority. And whereas we clearly had a responsibility once we had published something, did we really have a responsibility when someone sent us a very peculiar paper that raised all sorts of anxieties? And we thought we do, but I can remember at an early meeting, the editor of the British Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology saying, well, it's all right for you. You've got a big editorial team. You've got access to lawyers. You know, it's all right for you, but what about for us? It's really tough. You know, I'm doing this a day a week. I'm spending most of my weekends working at the journal. How on earth am I going to be able to deal with this? And one thing at the BMJ, we realized that this was such an issue that actually COPE wasn't enough for us. You know, we couldn't take every case to COPE. And so we created within house an ethics committee. And quite quickly, we began to think, you know, how on earth did we get by without an ethics committee? And I know that's continued at the BMJ. And I also, I now know that the BMJ has 2 people working full time on integrity issues. Whereas, back when we were starting Cope, there was nobody who was, spending any of their time thinking about integrity issues. It's become a much, much kind of bigger problem. And then the Lancet, of course, has its ombudsman for dealing with issues that come up. But I think often you probably can't rely just on Cope. You almost need to have some sort of in-house facility for dealing with all of this.
Yeah, I mean, I know that some of the larger publishing houses have research integrity groups of 20 to 30 people, and they're overwhelmed. So it is an issue. And this brings to mind is we've got about 10 minutes before we need to move on to the next session. But what do you see? And I think you've touched on a little bit of it, are the emerging threats that we all in this ecosystem need to be aware of, but that COPE needs to be alerted to or prepared to deal with. Any thoughts?
Well, it's of course, the whole, we have been talking about that already, but the whole incentive structure in science, that you publish, that's a publication is almost like currency. I wish we could get away from that, but that's a big issue. So that's and I would like to say something about an issue that we haven't talked about, and that is people that use COPE guidelines or are the definitions of misconduct to create problems for each other. We saw that at COPE many times. I've seen it many times later. That they, for example, we say, every author has to agree, and then one author just says, I don't agree anymore, and then you can't get the paper published. And there are conflicts. I have been on the sort of Norwegian research integrity, committee, and 2/3 of the cases are conflicts between researchers that want to hurt each other by saying that this paper is, you should retract this paper because this or that. And so they're using these guidelines against each other. And very often it is because of a conflict between people. And we can't get into that. But I remember at COPE many times when we were looking at cases and we said to ourselves, this is the most crazy we've ever seen, marrying,
Until next week.
until next week, what people could do, take, all the files with them, have a lover, all kinds of things, and that is just a problem that you have to be aware of, because otherwise you will get, really into something that takes your energy away.
Yeah, I think the term that we use frequently is the weaponization of these guidelines and of the peer review process has certainly, I think, matching some bigger cultural issues become a problem as well. Richard.
And I think one of the biggest problems now is that organized crime has moved into scientific publishing. I mean, we've always had fraudsters, but they've mostly been, operating on their own, although it's also true that you can see research groups that have a kind of dubious culture. But now I think organized crime has moved into all of this because they realize there's substantial amounts of money to be made. And a combination of paper mills and artificial intelligence means you can churn out these things at a huge rate, make a lot of money. And unfortunately, I mean, I was at a conference last week where we discussed this in some detail. We delude ourselves if we think that we can use artificial intelligence to identify the papers that are fraudulent. I think it's a huge problem. And as I was saying, I mean, Stephen Lott, my predecessor, wrote about a particular case we had in Britain and said, well, the problem is that a lot of editors are effectively amateurs. And so you've got this organized crime up against these people who are not well equipped to deal with all of this. And I think it's a very threatening set of circumstances. And as you said, Nancy, I mean, at last week's meeting, there was someone from Nature Group. They have 50, Springer Nature have 50 people working on research integrity, but it's a game of cat and mouse where I worry that the cats are the organized crime and the mice are the editors and the publishers. So I think it's a formidable problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Jenny?
Yeah, just to follow on to that. I mean, I just tying together both what Charlotte and Richard have said. This all comes back to the incentive system within academia, and that's one of the reasons why I guess I've shifted my kind of focus from from COPE towards to research assessment, which Dora and Koara and many other initiatives around the world are working on. There are who was it? The BMJ published on this. Help me out, Richard. Doug.
Doug Altman, the
Doug
scandal
Altman.
of medical research.
Exactly. There's too much research published, and it's poor quality. We should publish fewer papers, and we should publish higher quality papers. I honestly think that the only way that we are going to be able to get away from this whole concept of organized crime is simply to sort of understand that the system right now is fundamentally broken and being manipulated. So I think that this is why one of my absolute kind of passions at the moment is trying to link all this together, that we have to be working with the universities, with governments, with funding bodies, and rather than just us trying to play whack-a-mole at the journals and others trying to play whack-a-mole at the publishers, we have to have a consensus that the system right now is being gamed quite spectacularly. My favorite example of this was a researcher's grandmother's cat that was given a set of papers and became the most highly cited cat in the world, and nobody noticed it. We are at that point.
Wow, I hate to end on this note, but I think we're basically going to have to. We've got like 4 minutes before we need to move on, and interestingly, the next topic for the Publication Integrity Week is how AI is changing scholarly publishing. So we'll catch that theme up in the next few minutes. There is a link in the Q&A to Doug Altman's paper, if anyone is interested in finding that. Any last thoughts? As we've thought now from Richard and Mike, I always envisioned you were sitting in a pub somewhere talking about this, so I'm sort of disappointed it was in the BMJ offices. But nonetheless, as you moved from you two exchanging stories and trying to help each other to now 14,000 members all of the different stakeholders, any last thoughts about publication ethics that you want to pass on, or COPE, or things that you wish had gone differently?
Well, I mean, just to say, Nancy, I mean, when Richard and I think back at those old days, early days, back in the late 1990s, and think about where COPE has come now and the sort of challenges that it now faces, which are very, very different from the ones that we were facing. Ours were much more parochial, not well away from organized crime, and I think it's a real challenge. I don't think the challenge has diminished. I don't think we've cracked the problem, and I think there's still plenty of work to do out there. I don't know what you think, Richard.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think COPE is needed more than ever. And I mean, I want to congratulate on, I mean, it wasn't me, it was Mike to some extent, but certainly Charlotte and Ginny really developing COPE, because it's very much needed. And I want to support what Ginny and Charlotte have said. I think the incentive system within academia is all wrong, and it's going to perhaps be easier to change that than to try and counter organized crime. And I think maybe now it could really happen, because people have been talking about it for a very long time, but finding an alternative way to measuring publications doesn't seem to be forthcoming and widely adopted. But I do, I congratulate you on what you've achieved, and I think you've got a formidable problem, and I support the idea of changing the incentive. And I think, I mean, I continue to teach a course every year on research and publication ethics, where I sort of say to people, there's no substitute for thinking. You can't, in the end, reduce it just to a series of sort of guidelines on do this, do that. And it's always a fun session. But I think people need to be sensitized to the complexity of it.
Charlotte, any last thoughts?
It's on the same note that it is the whole system, and I don't think, as I think I mentioned to you, Nancy, that we realized at the time in the beginning of the 2000s, how fundamentally internet would change publishing. And now we are 25 years into that, and we can't just continue to think like we are small research groups publishing on paper. It has changed everything, and I congratulate Cope and also you, Ginny, for taking a more holistic view on sort of what needs to be done, because it can't be done by the journals only, but we can do our part.
And Jenny, last word.
Oh, look, thank you. This has been a fantastic session. The one thing I would just say is I think our power here is in the sort of the human curation of what we do. That's the thing that's always appealed to me about journals. And I think that one of the things that Cope did incredibly well was to help build a community of the individuals that have, kind of care about this stuff. And more than ever, Cope's voice and leadership is needed in this space. And I would just say, I'd really encourage Cope to be bold in what in next steps, because I think, we've got some really big challenges we've all got to face.
Well, I thank you all, and I agree this session turned out really super well. I've learned a lot, and I think it's teed up the rest of our Publication Integrity Week on a great foundation, not only this conversation, but what you four have provided in your wisdom and foresight 27, 28 years ago. With that, I think we need to close. The next group is coming on, and I thank you and I thank all the participants for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. So good day to everyone. If you're hanging on for the next one, please do, and be well.